The idea of creating a single aircraft capable of performing the most diverse missions emerged during the First World War. But it became especially relevant after the war ended, particularly for small countries. Many of them had only just appeared on the political map of Europe, and their military budgets were quite modest. They simply could not afford to purchase an entire fleet of specialized aircraft for each separate task. The First World War ended bitterly for Germany. Aircraft designers felt no better. Among them, a special place belonged to the Dutch engineer Anthony Fokker. His famous fighters struck fear into many Allied pilots, but those were far from the only aircraft produced in his factories. The company also built reconnaissance and training machines. And now all of this was under threat of coming to an end. By the end of 1918, numerous members of the Allied Control Commission were scurrying across defeated Germany like rats. They searched for anything that, in their opinion, could contribute to the revival of German military power. For some time, Fokker managed to avoid inspections, but by 1919, the situation became unbearable. And then he took a desperate step. In just 1.5 months, right under the noses of the Allies, he transported to his native Netherlands more than 200 aircraft, 120 fighters of one type, 20 of another, 60 reconnaissance planes, and many experimental machines, more than 400 engines, 100 parachutes, and significant stocks of aviation materials. The starting capital was substantial. In August of 1919, the Netherlands Aircraft Manufacturing Factory was registered in Amsterdam, and later the owner's name was added to its title. Soon, the aircraft plant was ready. At first, workers simply assembled aircraft from the transported parts. The first to be built were a fighter and a reconnaissance aircraft. To preserve continuity, Fokker kept the German system of designations on his machines. Later, their development continued in parallel, with new solutions implemented simultaneously. Calling this aircraft a novelty would be incorrect. It had been developed during the war, but it never made it to the front in time. Its design used proven features from Fokker fighters, applied for the first time to a two-seat machine. After the first model came several modifications. Some of them were widely used by the workers' and peasants' air fleet during the 1920s. In general, export work became a characteristic feature of Fokker's business. Little Holland, with its tiny armed forces, could not satisfy the ambitious plans of Anthony Fokker, who had already become famous. Moreover, another Flying Dutchman had returned home, Frederik Koolhoven. He, like Fokker, had built combat aircraft during the First World War, but for Britain. Foreign orders left a noticeable mark on the work of the company's designers. The firm became extremely flexible in order to meet the needs of a wide variety of customers. The most successful aircraft of the company in this regard became a two-seat multi-purpose aircraft, a true universal machine of its era. It used the typical layout of a classic single-engine biplane of the 1920s, fully repeating the configuration of an earlier model. The variety of possible roles was ensured by several interchangeable wing sets of different spans and by numerous armament options. The aircraft could serve as a short-range reconnaissance plane, a long-range reconnaissance plane, a light bomber, or a two-seat fighter. Considering the specifics of export orders, the designers provided an entire range of different engines, with air or liquid cooling, producing from 335 to 670 horsepower. The aircraft's design, created under the supervision of Reinhold Platz, was simple and inexpensive. It did not require the manufacturer to have complex tools or equipment. At its core, the fuselage featured a welded steel tube truss. Its rigidity was increased with tubular braces in the front and piano wire bracing in the rear. Stringers were mounted on top of the truss and covered with fabric. The wing, with constant cord across its entire span, was entirely wooden. The spars and ribs were made of pine. The covering was partly plywood and partly fabric. The upper wing was raised above the fuselage on steel tube struts, while the lower panels were attached directly to the fuselage spars. The interplane struts had the traditional N shape. Ailerons were installed only on the upper wing. True to Fokker tradition, they protruded beyond the wing tips and had a wooden frame with plywood covering. The highlight of the construction of the future universal aircraft was 3 interchangeable types of upper wings. A team of mechanics could replace any of them in 1 hour. The first type was intended for a short-range reconnaissance aircraft or a heavy fighter, with a wingspan of 39 feet and 6 inches. The second type was designed for a long-range reconnaissance aircraft, with a wingspan of 43 feet and 9 inches. And finally, the last type was for a light bomber with a wingspan of 47 feet and 11 inches. The vertical and horizontal tail surfaces on all three types had the same construction, steel tubes and fabric. The control surfaces had horn-type aerodynamic balance. To allow customers to choose different engines, the entire nose section of the fuselage was made as a removable module. Engines of different types were mounted on the same 4 bolts. The cowlings, of course, were made separately for each engine. They were made of aluminum and were quick release. If a liquid-cooled engine was installed, a water radiator was mounted beneath it. The landing gear with a solid axle was made from steel tubes of a teardrop cross-section, connected by hinges and reinforced with bracing wires. Shock absorption was provided by rubber buffers. At the rear, there was a swiveling tail skid. Both crew members sat in separate cockpits arranged in tandem, and if necessary, the aircraft could be equipped with dual controls and converted into a trainer. The first aircraft built had the A-type wing and was therefore called the C.V. http CVA-D. It was fitted with an American Liberty engine producing 420 horsepower, with which the aircraft reached a speed of 145 miles per hour. The service ceiling was 19,000 feet. The second machine was initially equipped with a German engine producing 250 horsepower, and later it was replaced with a French engine producing 400 horsepower. Slightly later, this variant was tested with a French Hispano-Suiza engine producing 450 horsepower. In the same year, a third experimental example appeared with the same Hispano engine. Later, another power plant was tested on it, the British Napier Lion engine producing 450 horsepower. The increased structural weight of the last two variants led to a reduction of maximum speed to 135 miles per hour and 130 miles per hour respectively. Customers were offered a choice of various armament configurations. The fighter version had the most powerful armament, 2 synchronized machine guns above the engine and 2 on the observer's turret. All other variants provided 1 machine gun in front and 1 or 2 in the rear cockpit, plus bomb racks under the center section. The aircraft performed well during tests. It was stable, sufficiently maneuverable, and responsive to the pilot. The next step in its evolution was the C.V. C.V. reconnaissance aircraft. It differed from earlier versions by its new trapezoidal wings with ailerons blended into the wing outline, as on fighters, and by an additional fuel tank installed in the central section of the upper wing. In 1925, the family was expanded with 2 new modifications that later displaced all previous ones. They differed primarily by their wing bay configuration. While the earlier types were practically clean biplanes, with the wingspan of the upper and lower wings almost the same, the new variants became sesquiplanes. The lower wing was significantly shorter than the upper one. In addition, the wings themselves were built according to the C.V. pattern, though without the additional fuel tanks. The modification with the shorter upper wing, 41 feet, was intended for use as a 2-seat fighter, an artillery spotter, or a short-range reconnaissance aircraft. In the first case, the aircraft carried 4 machine guns. In the second, 2 machine guns and a radio station. In the third, 3 machine guns, 1 in front and 2 in the rear. Another variant was a long-range reconnaissance aircraft and a daytime bomber. Its upper wing had a span of 50 feet. These last 2 variants also differed in the construction of their interwing struts. One had V-shaped struts and the other had N-shaped struts. In practice, this principle was sometimes violated. Part of the aircraft received N-shaped struts. Thus, the new modifications covered the entire range of combat roles that had previously required 3 separate types. What the experimental prototype looked like is unknown, and perhaps it did not exist at all, but the first aircraft was converted from an earlier model and fitted with a British Jupiter engine producing 420 horsepower. Such intense activity could not go unnoticed, and potential buyers began to visit Amsterdam more often as the new aircraft made a very favorable impression. The first order for 19 aircraft from the Dutch Armed Forces was received in December 1924. And by April 1925, the aircraft had passed its trials, and by the end of the year, the entire batch had been delivered. As the power plant, Hispano-Suiza engines producing 350 horsepower were used. In 1926, 7 more aircraft were built, and 6 more in 1927. The last two aircraft were equipped with British Armstrong Jaguar engines producing 360 horsepower. As part of the spare parts set, 2 fuselages were delivered. Wings were later purchased for them, and in the years from 1926 to 1929, 2 additional reconnaissance aircraft were assembled from these spare parts. In 1927, Sweden purchased several aircraft as samples. At first, they acquired 2 pairs of different models and reclassified them as 2-seat fighters. A year later, they bought another 4 aircraft and then another 6. All of them had Bristol Jupiter engines. In one of these aircraft, Lieutenant Hugo Lundborg evacuated Umberto Nobile from the camp of the survivors of the crash of the airship Italia. During the second landing, one of the skis got stuck in the snow and the aircraft flipped over. In January 1928, the Swedes bought a license for both modifications, and starting from 1929, the workshops in Malmslätt began producing them. By 1932, they had assembled 24 aircraft with Jupiter engines. In 1933, they produced 1 more aircraft and 10 machines, with Mercury engines rated at 600 horsepower, which were manufactured in Sweden by the company Nohab. Thus, the Swedish Air Force received 49 aircraft of this family, including several units fitted with floats. Their design turned out to be much more successful than that of the Dutch seaplanes. The floats were larger and stronger, the struts were reinforced, and the rudder was also enlarged. Starting from 1927, the government of Hungary purchased a total of 15 aircraft of various modifications. However, like Germany, Hungary was restricted by the Versailles Agreements, which prohibited the creation of a military air force. Nevertheless, it existed secretly. These aircraft were used as light bombers, reconnaissance planes, and training machines. Officially, they were registered as postal or meteorological aircraft. This did not prevent them from carrying 2 machine guns and racks for 440 pounds of bombs, which were removed before public demonstrations or photography. At the end of 1927, the Hungarians acquired a license to produce 50 aircraft. Nearly a year later, in December 1928, the Manfred Weiss Company plant in Budapest produced the first Hungarian-built aircraft. Hungarian machines differed from the original by having struts of a different shape. Later, final assembly was transferred to the workshops at the Ferihegy airfield. The last 9 machines had a different undercarriage design. All these aircraft were equipped with French copies of Jupiter engines rated at 420 horsepower. Beginning in 1933, the Hungarians launched production of improved variants of the aircraft, refined by the designer Laszlo Varga. The first of them was a reconnaissance aircraft, and the second was a bomber. Interestingly, their main difference was the number of engine cylinders and, accordingly, its power. The reconnaissance aircraft was fitted with a 9-cylinder Mistral engine rated at 590 horsepower, while the bomber had a 14-cylinder Mistral major engine rated at 860 horsepower. Respectively, 8 and 4 units were produced. Switzerland in 1927 acquired 3 aircraft with Jupiter engines, and 4 years later, 3 more machines. In 1932, the factories in Thun and Altenrhein received an order for 50 aircraft with Hispano-Suiza engines rated at 600 horsepower. In 1933, they produced 41 aircraft, and in 1934, another 8. Some sources state that 45 machines were built by a subsidiary of the Dornier Company. The aircraft featured a modified radiator and a later type undercarriage. 1 aircraft with a Liberty engine was purchased for study by the Air Force of the Soviet Union. In November 1926, this machine underwent testing at the research airfield. The aircraft modification was not specified in the report, which is unsurprising. The fuselage was purchased as a single unit, and there were 2 sets of wings. Their wingspans corresponded to 2 different types. The aircraft was tested with both wing variants under loads corresponding to an artillery spotter, a long-range reconnaissance aircraft, and a light bomber. The tests were successful. The aircraft proved faster and gained altitude better than the domestic machine, with the same combat load, although it was slightly inferior in maneuverability during horizontal flight. The foreign aircraft also demonstrated better takeoff and landing characteristics. The report concluded, "Recognize this aircraft as deserving of great attention." They noted the successful design of the control cables and the overall strength of the machine, while among the drawbacks they listed inconvenience in draining water and oil in winter due to the small passage diameter of the valves and an unsuccessful undercarriage design, Soviet specialists believed that the previous model had a better undercarriage. There were also complaints about the engine installation. Due to the small radiator cross-section, the engine overheated. It was proposed to test the aircraft with a more powerful Lorraine-Dietrich engine. The machine was left at the research airfield, which later became a research institute, for developing the tactics of using two-seat fighters and for equipment testing. It served there at least until the summer of 1933. In the late 1920s, this aircraft took part in comparative tests with various Soviet machines. In December 1927, engineer Stoneman proposed a project to convert the aircraft to a German engine with an albatross radiator, but it was never implemented. In 1931, the northern Chinese warlord Zhang Shuiliang, the son of the same Zhang Zuolin who had been defeated by the Red Army in 1928, commanded his own army that did not obey the central government of China. He signed a contract to purchase 20 fighters and 30 reconnaissance aircraft. In August of that same year, one of the fighters began undergoing tests in Mukden, but work in China went wrong from the very beginning. The problem started with the fact that there was no translator who knew both Chinese and Dutch. As a result, communication took place through a Russian émigré who translated into English or German. Because of this, information was often delivered in a distorted form, which could lead to dangerous consequences. For example, during a demonstration of ground target shooting, several people nearly died, including a representative of the company. Naturally, after such an incident, the contract was terminated, and the reconnaissance aircraft that arrived on the 15th of October was not even allowed to fly. The next step in development was a new version of the aircraft with a redesigned landing gear and a Bristol Pegasus engine producing 730 horsepower enclosed in a special cowling ring. Such aircraft were built to order for Denmark and Finland. Unlike the Finns, the Danes intended to buy a prototype and then produce the aircraft under license at home. It was ferried to Copenhagen in July 1933. Based on this prototype, 30 aircraft, according to other sources, 23, were built in two variants. The first variant had modified tail surfaces compared to the prototype, while the second also received an extended engine cowling. The Finns had purchased their first aircraft with a 420 horsepower Jupiter engine as early as 1927, but due to lack of funds, they postponed the acquisition of a full batch of aircraft they liked and completed it only in 1935. At that time, the aviation of the country of Suomi received 13 machines, now equipped with Bristol Pegasus engines producing 620 horsepower. Unlike the Danish aircraft, they retained the original hook-shaped rudder. By 1936, production of these aircraft had already stopped everywhere except Norway, where a few units continued to be built each year. The last significant variant to appear was a Dutch modernization project for the entire fleet of such machines in the country's air force. In 1933, a proposal was made to equip the aircraft with British Rolls-Royce Kestrel engines producing 580 horsepower. In 1934 and 1935, the conversion of the aircraft began. The work was carried out at the Fokker factory in Amsterdam and at Army aviation workshops. Fokker modernized 10 aircraft in this way, and the workshops converted another 40. The modified machines received a new designation. In addition to the new engine, they were fitted with a new landing gear with wheels equipped with brakes positioned farther forward. On some aircraft, the upper fuel tank was moved into the fuselage. 5 aircraft were equipped with dual controls and became training machines. Not stopping there, Fokker and the workshops assembled 7 new aircraft from spare parts, 5 and 2 respectively. Following the example of the converted aircraft but without replacing the engine, another 5 machines were upgraded. In total, the Dutch Air Force received 71 improved aircraft. Modernization of previously purchased and domestically built aircraft was also carried out in Denmark. 5 machines were converted, and they remained in service until 1935. The aircraft were upgraded to the standard of later models. The appearance of this aircraft stimulated the creation of several designs that were essentially products of its further evolution. One of these was certainly the Hungarian aircraft, which differed from the original through an elongated engine cowling, a new landing gear, and side windows in the cockpit. In Switzerland, a company released a model in 1936 featuring a more streamlined cowling, new vertical tail surfaces, a tunnel radiator, a variable pitch propeller with a spinner on the hub, streamlined fairings on the main landing gear wheels, and a tail wheel instead of a skid. But the Hungarian three-seat project moved farthest from the original aircraft. Only the wings and tail surfaces from the Fokker remained. The fuselage, which now had an oval cross-section, became much bulkier, allowing 3 crew members to be placed in a closed cockpit with an enlarged dorsal fairing. Teardrop-shaped fairings were planned for the landing gear wheels. However, as a result of all these improvements, the aircraft gained significant weight, which caused a drastic reduction in flight performance. In addition, cockpit visibility worsened severely, and serial production was out of the question. Nevertheless, this interesting biplane was used for various research purposes for several years. After that, the aircraft had fully exhausted its potential. By this time, more than 1,000 examples of this aircraft and its variants had been built worldwide, with about 600 produced in the Netherlands alone. Naturally, with such numbers, the Fokkers were destined to take part in combat actions, which began in various parts of the globe as the international situation worsened. Their involvement in colonial operations in Libya has already been mentioned earlier, but the first true war in which the C.V. aircraft took part was the conflict between Bolivia and Paraguay. In September 1938, a disgraceful agreement was signed in Munich to divide Czechoslovakia between Germany, Hungary, and Poland. Even during the negotiations at the beginning of the month, the Hungarian army began concentrating forces along the Czech border. At that time, most Hungarian Fokkers had already been withdrawn from combat units. Only the 1st and the 7th Reconnaissance Squadrons still had a few such aircraft, alongside the He-46. From the end of September, Hungarian aircraft began frequently violating the border. They not only conducted reconnaissance, but also fired on Czechoslovak army units and fortifications. Naturally, this provoked corresponding actions from Czechoslovakia. At the beginning of November, the country was partitioned, but the border remained tense. In March 1939, a real war broke out between Hungary and the newly formed Slovakia. However, by that time, all Fokkers had already been removed from the combat inventory of the Hungarian Air Force. Then it was the Finnish Fives that had their turn to demonstrate their combat qualities. By the end of November 1939, when the famous Winter War began, the Finnish Air Force had 6 Fokker C.V. HTTP CVE aircraft. Together with 4 CX machines, they formed the 14th Squadron based at Lyko. From the first days of the war, the 3rd flight of this squadron, which had 5 CV aircraft, began flying reconnaissance missions and bombing forward Soviet positions. On the 15th of December, the flight was transferred to Kononsuo, where together with the 2nd flight, detached from the 12th Squadron with 4 CX aircraft, it formed the so-called Salo Detachment. It was placed under the operational control of the headquarters of the 1st Air Regiment. However, as early as the 21st, the 5 flight was sent to Risele, where on the 25th it was reinforced with 3 Swedish machines of the same type. However, the flight, whose increased strength now resembled a full squadron, did not remain in this composition for long. After the New Year holidays, on the 3rd of January, an order arrived to transfer the newly arrived aircraft to the 16th Squadron. On the 12th of February, the remaining 5 aircraft were also sent there. In the new unit, the aircraft were distributed as follows. The trio of Swedish machines entered the 1st flight, and the 5 Dutch aircraft joined the 3rd flight. By that time, the situation at the front was becoming increasingly tense. A new Soviet offensive that began on the 1st of February led to a breakthrough of the Mannerheim Line. Transferred on the 16th to Swistamo, the squadron, like the rest of the Finnish air units, desperately tried to hinder the enemy's advance. Despite the absolute air dominance of Soviet fighters, not a single 5 was shot down by the pilots of the I-16 or the I-15. And because the Finnish biplane crews usually delivered their bombing strikes directly along the forward line, the fire of heavy anti-aircraft artillery did not interfere with them much either. However, they often had to fly through the fire of quadruple Maxims, light machine guns, and volleys from Mosin rifles. Although Soviet infantry cannot boast of shooting down even one Fokker of this type, combat damage could not always be avoided. On the 25th of February, 2 Swedish machines of the 1st flight were written off as beyond repair. The Dutch aircraft fought more successfully and survived until the end of the war without losses. In total, during the Winter War, Finnish CVE HTTP CV aircraft carried out more than 200 combat sorties. After the war, they were transferred to training units, where their modest ranks were reinforced by 2 intern Norwegian CVD aircraft. The strategic importance of Denmark and Norway meant that sooner or later both countries would be drawn into the orbit of the Second World War. In the spring of 1940, the second phase of the German Blitzkrieg struck them. At that time, the Danish Air Force had only 16 Fokker C.V. CVE aircraft. In addition, several dozen CVB machines served as trainers, and another 24 were stored disassembled in warehouses. Early in the morning on the 9th of April, a group of German He-111 aircraft escorted by Bf-110 appeared over Copenhagen. When they flew over the Værløse Air Base, a single Danish Fokker DXX-10 fighter took off and was immediately shot down. Then the Bf-110 aircraft strafed the parking areas and anti-aircraft positions along the airfield's edges, leaving behind the burning wreckage of 14 Fokkers, 10 CV HTTP CVE machines from both reconnaissance squadrons and 4 DXXM fighters. On their way out of the attack, a pair of German twin-engine fighters encountered a lone 5 returning from a training flight and sent it down with a single pass. With that, the fighting for Danish aviation essentially ended. The government signed a capitulation, and at German demand, the entire aircraft fleet was put into storage. In Norway, the situation developed very differently. At the moment of the German invasion, the small Norwegian Air Force had only 40 Fokker aircraft, and of course could not seriously resist the Germans. But the mountainous terrain, severe weather conditions, and the near-complete absence of roads worked in favor of the defenders. Without roads, the Germans could not use their motorized units. Although on the 9th of April, the Germans lost the 2 cruisers Blücher and Karlsruhe, and on the following day also Königsberg, the success was entirely on their side. In Oslo, Kristiansand, Stavanger, Bergen, Trondheim, and Narvik, they landed about 10,000 soldiers who formed the first echelon of 3 divisions. The Germans also managed to capture all airfields in the southern part of the country. However, they did not succeed in destroying the Norwegian Air Force. When the German crews arrived at the Værnes airfield, they saw only empty parking stands. The bombing raid on the Kjeller Air Base resulted in the destruction of only 2 training aircraft. All the others by that time were already flying north. The most dramatic events of the first day unfolded at the largest Norwegian airbase, Sola, near Stavanger. From there, all combat-ready aircraft were preparing for a flight deeper into the country. 3 Capronis, 4 Fokkers of one type, and 2 of another. At the very moment when the crews began starting their engines, a group of 8 German bombers accompanied by a pair of heavy fighters appeared over the airfield. The first bomb hit a Caproni, but the remaining aircraft began taxiing onto the runway. And it happened just in time. A few minutes after the bombing, German transport aircraft carrying paratroopers arrived. The preparations for departure were so rushed that one Fokker took off with its tanks not fully refueled. When the fuel ran out, the pilot had to make an emergency landing on an unprepared field, and the aircraft crashed. The next day, all combat-ready Army aircraft were gathered on the ice of Lake Vangsmo, where they were fitted with skis. The combined aviation group was named Group R, and it was led by Captain Ole Reistad. Unfortunately, 9 Fokkers from the flight school could not join this formation. After several relocations and the loss of 1 more aircraft due to an engine failure, their command eventually lost all contact. Not understanding what was happening in other regions of the country, on the 15th of April, the command decided to ferry the remaining aircraft to Sweden. If in the south, the resistance of the Norwegians was suppressed rather quickly, which was undoubtedly aided by complete German air dominance, then in the central part of the country, and especially in the north, the fighting lasted much longer. On the 14th of April, one of the Fokkers sent on reconnaissance discovered 11 German transport aircraft on the ice of Lake Hartvigvan, transferring mountain troops to the north. After the reconnaissance aircraft returned, the command sent 6 aircraft for a bombing strike, one of which, besides the usual bombs weighing 110 pounds, also carried a camera. The Norwegian attack was unsuccessful. The bombs, dropped from an altitude of 2,950 feet, fell far from the Junkers aircraft, and only a few planes received light damage from fragments. It would seem that after such a visit, the German command should have removed the aircraft, but this turned out to be impossible. The transports were standing with nearly empty tanks and, like cattle at the slaughterhouse, were passively awaiting their fate. One of the Fokker crews, after refueling at Bardufoss, soon reappeared over the improvised German airfield. This time everything went perfectly. An approach along the line of aircraft, and a series of explosions engulfed the 3-engine planes. 2 of them instantly turned into fireballs, and 4 more were damaged. On the 16th of April, a Norwegian reconnaissance aircraft confirmed that the surviving planes were still in the same place, and a group of 3 Fokkers bombed them again. They destroyed 3 of the 4 aircraft ready for takeoff and heavily damaged 5 more. The 4th Junkers did manage to take off, successfully avoiding the Norwegian bombs, but only to be interned over Swedish territory. This was likely the last success of the Norwegian Fokkers. On the 22nd of April, Luftwaffe reconnaissance discovered the location of Group R, and on the same day, German bombers raided the ice airfield at Lake Vangamos. The main target was the twin-engine Caproni, which the Germans had previously failed to destroy. This raid was nearly ineffective, but subsequent ones could have been more successful, so the decision was made to relocate. The aircraft departed in small groups and flew to the new base along different routes. One crew was forced to make an emergency landing due to a malfunction. To assist with repairs, 2 more aircraft landed nearby. When the work was almost finished, 3 German dive bombers appeared in the sky. They attacked as if on a training mission. 2 Fokkers were reduced to wreckage, and the 3rd had to be repaired until the next morning when it finally managed to take off. But the crew's luck had clearly run out. Heading north, the pilot entered a spin above the mountains. Meanwhile, the aircraft that had not yet managed to leave the ice airfield on Lake Vangamos suffered a new raid. This time a German reconnaissance bomber arrived. Its crew dropped 6 bombs weighing 110 pounds each, whose explosions mangled 2 Norwegian aircraft. Over another lake, the bomber's gunner managed to destroy yet another Norwegian aircraft. The weather improved, and German aerial reconnaissance quickly discovered the new base of the Norwegian Air Forces. After 2 raids on the Setnesmoen airfield, which took place on April 30th, the number of Fokkers was reduced to 7. The technical personnel suffered significant losses. On May 4th, 2 Norwegian aircraft departed to bomb the positions of the mountain Jaegers in the area of the lake at an altitude of 2,559 feet, while another pair bombed targets east of Ligastund. At this time, in the Narvik area, 13 German bombers attacked the English ships. Somewhere near the coast, the routes of the Fokkers and the German aircraft accidentally crossed, resulting in a rather unusual aerial battle. The clash began at the initiative of the German crew, who directed their bomber head-on toward the pair of Norwegians. One of the Fokkers immediately decided to flee, while the other, with Lieutenants Eggen and Killingmark on board, accepted the fight. For 10 minutes, the opponents poured machine gun bursts at each other. While the number of holes in the old biplane gradually increased, the German aircraft seemed to catch bullets without any visible damage. Realizing it was time to escape, the Fokker pilot put the aircraft into a dive and, leveling out at low altitude, slipped into a narrow valley between the mountains. The Norwegian pilot hoped to shake off the German bomber, but his hopes were not destined to come true. When cliffs suddenly rose in front of his aircraft at the end of the valley, he was forced to pull the control stick toward himself. This was exactly the moment the navigator of the German aircraft flying just above the mountain peaks was waiting for. A short burst from the nose machine gun pierced the Norwegian biplane. The aircraft was still holding in the air, but both pilots were seriously wounded this time, although the pilot managed to bring the machine back to the airfield. Meanwhile, the number of aircraft in the Norwegian Air Forces, which had no possibility of replenishment, was rapidly decreasing. On May 7th, 1 Fokker from the northern group crashed during landing, leaving only 2 biplanes and 1 training aircraft in the unit. The next day, all aircraft that were in flying condition, 5 combat biplanes, the same number of training aircraft, and 1 light aircraft, stationed in the central part of the country, flew north. While their crews were making their way to the new base, a group of 4 German bombers in the Ofot Fjord area encountered a lone Norwegian biplane sent on reconnaissance, and after a brief battle, turned it into a burning torch. The end was near, but nevertheless, the crews of the Norwegian biplanes held on until the beginning of June. On the 6th, 1 aircraft dropped its bombs on German positions at an altitude of 2,044 feet, and 2 days later, on June 8th, the last 2 Norwegian Fokkers flew to Finland. For the Dutch, the war began on May 10, 1940. By this time, they still had 28 combat biplanes in service, assigned to 4 of the 5 groups of the 2nd Aviation Regiment. The aircraft were based in Hilversum, Rügenhoek, and Gilze Rijn. In the invasion of Holland, the main role belonged to the airborne units, for the landing of which in key areas of the country about 500 transport aircraft were deployed. The drops were preceded by powerful air raids, as a result of which the Dutch Air Force lost 42 aircraft on the ground out of the 132 available. Trying to counter the actions of the German paratroopers, the Dutch command threw into combat all aircraft in flying condition, including the obsolete Fokkers, whose crews sometimes had to operate without fighter cover, breaking through to the target through groups of German fighters and dense defensive fire from anti-aircraft defenses delivered by the same transport aircraft. The main targets for the Dutch pilots became their own bridges across the canals and the airfields. The latter were real wasps' nests. For example, on May 10th, 8 C.V aircraft and 3 CX aircraft carried out a suicidal raid without fighter cover on the Ypenburg and Valkenburg airfields captured by the paratroopers. According to aerial reconnaissance, about 50 Junkers were already standing there. As a result, 5 Fokkers were left burning near the runway. They were shot down by anti-aircraft artillery. By the evening of May 14th, after 4 days of fierce fighting, the Dutch Air Force was completely destroyed. But this did not mean the end of the story of the 5. When, at the end of June 1941, Finland joined Germany in the war against the USSR, the Finnish Air Force was in urgent need of replenishing its combat strength. However, it was impossible to quickly obtain modern combat aircraft even from Germany at that moment. The command was forced to return the already retired C.V aircraft to service, assigning them to a newly formed squadron. It received 4 Fokkers and 4 Ripens. The squadron was assigned to the 14th Infantry Division operating in Karelia. Its primary task was tactical reconnaissance, but whenever possible, the crews also carried out bombing strikes. Thanks to the almost complete absence of Soviet fighters, the Fokkers operated very actively, circling for hours over Soviet positions. Yet this could not last forever. On the 21st of September, a lone C.V. intercepted by a Soviet Chaika crashed into the ground after a brief battle right before the eyes of Finnish infantrymen. The lesson was learned, and after this incident, the Fokkers flew behind the front line only under fighter escort. Soon, another aircraft was lost during the approach for landing after sustaining damage from anti-aircraft fire. On the 5th of November, the 2 aircraft that remained were transferred to the 3rd Detachment of the 14th Squadron. From then on, all combat machines of this type served exclusively in that unit. During the day, the crews mainly conducted reconnaissance and corrected artillery fire, and the latter could also be done at night. In the dark hours, they also operated as light bombers. After the beginning of 1943, their tasks included combat against partisans who, it must be said, were not particularly numerous in Karelia compared to Belarus. In total, 9 Fokkers passed through the 14th Squadron during the war, 7 of which were lost. However, only 1 of them was lost for combat-related reasons. In June and July of 1943, 1 aircraft was transferred to the 35th Training Squadron and another to the 6th, where the crew had to master a calmer profession, that of target towing. In this role, the aircraft worked until the 23rd of November 1944, and the last Finnish C.V. from the training squadron was placed into storage on the 14th of February 1945. It would seem that the combat career of the C.V. had come to an end, but in the middle of the war, the Germans appreciated the effectiveness of Soviet light night bombers and began creating similar units. New Luftwaffe bombing groups, called night assault in German terminology, alongside powerful fighter bombers, FW-190G and dive bombers Ju-87D, were also equipped with aircraft analogous to the Soviet cornfield planes, obsolete light bombers and training aircraft. At the same time, the Germans did not disdain using captured machines taken in various countries. In August 1943, they requisitioned all Fokkers stored in the hangars of the former Danish military aviation. There turned out to be 5 aircraft of one modification and 20 of another. Some of them were used to equip the Estonian and Lithuanian groups. Both of these units became part of a formation operating under the operational control of the headquarters of the 1st Air Fleet of the Luftwaffe. Both groups operated with reasonable success near Leningrad and in the Baltic region, but the war was moving toward its inevitable end. In October 1944, 2 pilots, taking their families with them, fled across the Baltic Sea to Sweden, where they were granted political asylum. In April 1947, one of the aircraft was returned to Denmark by the Swedish government. And how did the Fokkers fare among the neutrals? In Sweden, they did not survive until the war. They had been withdrawn from service earlier. However, 4 interned Norwegian aircraft served in a private company. Its crews, contracted by the armed forces, towed targets for anti-aircraft training. The last aircraft still flying was returned to Norway in 1949. In Switzerland in August 1939, there were 27 aircraft, 18 in the 1st Regiment and 9 in the 3rd. More modern aircraft were produced until the end of 1937, and in 1942, another 8 machines were assembled from surplus spare parts. Until the end of that year, they served in combat units, after which they were transferred to training and auxiliary roles. Today, there are 5 surviving C.V. aircraft in the world. Finland has 1 aircraft without wings, and Sweden has 1 that is capable of flight. Another is on display in the Museum of the Swiss Air Force. 1 machine is preserved in the Netherlands. The Norwegians restored the aircraft returned by the Swedes and repainted it as a combat machine of April 1940. This is all that remains today of the great C.V. family, which flew across the world and rightfully holds its place in the history of global aviation.